Hello everyone, and welcome to another Learning Lunch hosted by Format Approved. The title of today's event is Preventing Security Risk Analysis Failure and Protecting Your Practice. We're joined today by Charles Killmer of Netgain, who I'll introduce more formally here in a moment. I am your host, Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved, and I host these Learning Lunch events. It's always a pleasure, but it's a special pleasure when we have such a great guest. Charles Killmer, thank you so much for joining us, first of all.
You're welcome. Always a pleasure.
So Charles has been with us on at least one previous Learning Lunch, and the last one was really just a great, one of the best ones we ever did. It was on cloud security and backup. Really interesting stuff. He has, as you can see on your screen, a lot of experience and expertise in security, particularly as it pertains to healthcare, and so he's going to be a great guide for us today as we go through our questions. These are the questions we're going to talk about today. I'm going to let you look at those while I just take care of a couple of quick housekeeping notes. People always ask us, hey, can I get the slides for this thing? And the answer is yes. We will send you a follow-up email after this event where you'll have access to the slides and a recording if you'd like to watch it again or share it with people. So don't worry about that. If you are interested in getting those materials, we'll send them to you afterward. Secondly, you can ask questions of our presenter at any time during today's session. We generally, just type those into your chat area. We generally hold those until the end so that we don't run out of time, but we do try to keep a little bit of time at the end to answer those questions. And if we don't get to all of them, that's fine because we'll send those on to Charles and he can answer them in writing and get you the information that you need. All right, enough of the housekeeping. Let's begin. So this is a question I think that comes up a lot, and I hear people use these terms interchangeably, Charles, but what is the difference between a risk assessment and a risk analysis? There is something different, isn't there?
There is. While the two words are very similar, analysis and assessment, analysis has a lot more to do with the depth, and specifically HIPAA requires a risk analysis in the security rule. Every covered entity and business associated in HIPAA-covered organization must do a risk analysis to protect the EPHI that they manage. It's a proactive step to make sure that risks to the EPHI are evaluated and addressed. The text of that rule is to have a complete and thorough assessment of all of the risks. And even there they use the word assessment when defining risk analysis. Risk analysis is the in-depth assessment of the risks. They do call out risk assessment, but that's more on the breach notification side of the world. When there is a breach of PHI, of the security of the PHI, or the privacy, you must do an assessment of the scope of that breach. Questions there would entail the type of breach of that breach, the identity of the person or people that authorized or accessed it in an unauthorized manner, whether the EPHI was actually removed from its place physically or viewed remotely, and the level of mitigation of the risk to the PHI that the organization will conduct. So the best way to understand that difference is the risk analysis is a requirement from HIPAA to proactively protect the EPHI. Risk assessment is that reactive, now that PHI has been breached, how do we assess the damage?
All right, well I know we're going to talk about both of those subjects in more depth as we go. So this is a great question too, in terms of the scope of the analysis. So the question is, how is the scope of the analysis determined? And what we're getting at here is what all needs to be included, right?
Right. So as with any compliance standard, the question of scope identifies what needs to be compliant. In the PCI world, the credit card compliance standard, where is all the credit card data and what are the risks to it? In the HIPAA world, where is all the medical data and what are the risks to it? The easiest way to start identifying the scope of compliance is identify where the data is that has to be compliant. So in the medical world, where is that EPHI that needs to be compliant? That typically is at least within your EHR, but it could be within a file system on a server. A lot of organizations have PHI stored in other locations, not just the EHR. So the scope extends to those file servers as well. Scope creep is an easy thing to do, and it's necessary. Every server that's on the same network as the server that has the PHI is also in scope. So this extends to any device that is able to view the PHI. This could include home computers, which a lot of organizations are very eager about the flexibility that this mobility gives us, but the security risks that are presented by it need to be considered as well. So now home computer networks are also in scope, and that includes any computer that's on that home network. This scope creep only stops when a sufficient firewall boundary is encountered. And this is a little bit more technical definition of where the scope is, so take some notes if you don't understand the technical words and language, and talk to your IT organization. The curious one is the explosion of the infamous BYOD. Everybody has these smartphones, and as I said, we're all eager for the great flexibility and benefits of the mobility, but the security risks presented by it compound. Now you have to worry about the ePHI that may be accessible on an employee's personal cell phone that they may let their spouse use, or their kids, or their grandparents. And if that device gets stolen or lost, what ePHI did it have on it? What does that do to your breach evaluation? So determining the scope is a very difficult thing to do, but it's necessary in figuring out what needs to be compliant.
Well, it's certainly one of those areas. It shows you why most organizations need help in doing this properly, because they don't have the expertise to figure out what the scope is. I've never heard the term scope creep. That's really amusing, but it makes perfect sense. And I could not agree more with you about the BYOD thing. This has bothered me for years, that so many doctors' offices now are allowing people inside the organization to just go into what's supposed to be a secure network with their private phones. I don't think people realize what a huge risk that really is.
Yep. And you said professional organizations have it covered, but even there, we all remember Target, and I'm not singling them out because they did things poorly. It was what everybody did at the time, but the hackers had the advantage. Target wasn't breached because of a failing in Target's network. Target was breached because of a failing in one of their vendors' networks. And they missed expanding the scope far enough to include the access that vendor had.
Right, I believe it was an HVAC company. Very
There
unfortunate.
Was.
So
and they were not targeted because they had access to Target. They were
right.
It was an opportunistic hack.
Right, so they got
to get into the HVAC.
Right, they got phished. Yep. And picked up malware, and then the hackers realized, wow, we actually have a backdoor into Target. This is the big time.
Absolutely.
So there are so many myths about security risk analysis, but tell us, what are the most common myths?
I'll go through a couple of them that I've written down. One is that the security risk analysis is optional for small providers, and it's really not. It's required for all covered entities. Anyone that has medical information that they use to treat or take care of patients, if they fall under HIPAA, they're required to have a risk analysis performed. Additionally, the providers that want to seek some EHR incentive payments must conduct a risk analysis as well. Simply installing a certified EHR fulfills a security risk analysis meaningful use requirement, and even that, while the EHR may be certified, a risk analysis still needs to be conducted so you can show that you've evaluated whether or not it handles your PHI securely. In addition to that, it can't control PHI that lives outside of it. It can't control the policies of your organization or how your monitors are situated next to the windows of your office. One is that an EHR vendor took care of everything I need to do about privacy and security. And again, the EHR vendor really only has control over the software they write. How you configure it and everything else that affects the security and privacy of your PHI is outside of what that EHR vendor is capable of doing. One, a little misleading about whether or not you need to outsource your risk analysis. And while you don't need to, I highly recommend outsourcing it. Let professionals do what they do best. Your outsourced risk analysis will find more than you will internally, unless you've got some large investment in your IT security staff. It's more efficient, in my opinion, to use an outsourced firm to do the risk analysis. They've got the experience and they know what HIPAA is looking for, and they'll have more experience in finding it.
That's
One is that a checklist. Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say that's a great point, because even if you were looking at, say, a hospital that does have a large IT staff, there's even good reasons for them to look for outside help, because their expertise isn't necessarily in HIPAA, maybe not with the same level of depth as a security expert, but also they're inside the organization. So there's a tendency to sort of not see what the trees are because you're so accustomed to the forest, if I'm not mangling that metaphor. But my point, of course, is that they live with this stuff all day. It's easier for an outside expert to see things with fresh eyes and really get a good assessment, a good analysis, rather, of what that risk is.
Yep, and that internal team can get sidetracked by other priorities or urgent situations. Sure. The outsourced firm, they won't get sidetracked. They've got one job to do for you, and they're going to finish that.
Well, I interrupted you.
Oh, yeah. Whether or not a checklist will suffice for the risk analysis requirement. Checklists are great tools, but they don't fill the requirement of a risk analysis. They can help getting the thorough or comprehensive analysis, but you still have to do the analysis part, identifying and brainstorming what are the risks presented by each little item on that checklist. One is about a specific risk analysis method that must be followed, and HIPAA does not specify any sort of protocol or method that must be followed for risk analysis. This is something that an organization can learn how to effectively conduct a risk analysis, but if you outsource it, you can trust that to the outsourced firm to do correctly. There is a lot of guidance on how to do that on the OCR and ONC websites as well.
Yeah, and I just would add that ONC, as you said before, there's no requirement that an outside group help you with the risk analysis, but ONC does discuss the fact that it's a good idea to look for additional help. Right. So how often does an organization need to perform a risk analysis?
So the risk analysis needs to be done once, and then following that, subsequently, it needs to be reviewed. And the difference there is the analysis and review that we'll get into a little bit later. So the risk analysis needs to be done comprehensive, thorough, complete. Some organizations will do it every month or every year. If you're a small organization and things don't change in your environment often, you could get by and justify a lower frequency. But all of those depend upon how your organization works and changes. Once you've identified the scope of your compliance, you really should do that update to that analysis whenever anything in that scope changes, whether it's new software or new doors being installed. For the EHR incentive program, the requirement is for eligible providers to conduct a review of their security risk analysis and implement any necessary changes at least once per calendar year, and attest to conducting the analysis or review. So while you could get by with a lower frequency, you still have to do this risk analysis or review whenever you want to do that meaningful use attestation.
And folks have asked, someone already asked a question about MIPS, and MU has sort of been folded into MIPS, but it has no bearing on this in the sense that, because we do a lot of work on MIPS at Format Approved, the requirement for the security risk analysis is exactly the same. So if you're thinking, well, meaningful use, that's what required it. It doesn't matter. Now that they call it ACI, same deal. The objective for doing the risk analysis is still the first one, and it's exactly the same. So it makes no difference.
Right. Yep.
So can I do, we already have talked a lot about this, but to sort of touch on it again, can I do it in-house or is it better to hire outside?
Yeah, we did sort of touch on that already. Yeah, I don't have much more to say on that. Other than that, there are some free tools, and the OCR and ONC websites do provide a lot of help in doing the risk analysis in-house. Really evaluate the value you're getting from that checklist effectively that they provide. It's a checklist with guidance, in my opinion,
Yeah.
and weigh that against
So you're
the
talking about
outcomes.
the free ONC tool that they have?
Yep. They've got some other articles on there, other guidance documents as well.
Yeah, I feel the same way you do, that because I've looked at that free tool a lot. I don't know if anybody on the call has, but it really is just a big checklist. It's not really a risk analysis.
Yeah, it's a good tool, and I'm glad they've summarized it.
Yeah.
I think it provides some sort of awareness and perspective of what a full risk analysis would entail, which may make justifying outsourcing it easier.
Well, I think some people would look at that checklist and immediately, because it is, even though it's not thorough enough, it still is very, very long. And I'm sure that lots of people look at it and say, I'm not doing this. And they usually shouldn't.
Yeah. Even if they do 10 a week, it'll still take them a long time to get through, and that's not a very fast.
And that is a point you made earlier about efficiency, and that's something we could add again, is that if you are doing it yourself, maybe you can do it, and maybe it would even withstand review from OCR, although probably not. But is it really worth your time to do that when you are in this business to practice medicine and you're not a security expert? Security expert can do it so much faster and better probably than you could.
Right, and they've got enough templates available to use where slotting the vulnerabilities and the issues they identify in your organization into a nice, understandable executive summary detailed document rather quickly.
And that's really what OCR wants to see, is that level of analysis.
Yep.
So what are some common pitfalls? Since we've talked about the checklists, and you mentioned that some people sometimes think it's EHR, the EHR is going to take care of everything. Tell us more about that.
One pitfall is having an overly narrow view, and this touches back to the scope assessment. Having a view that the EHR is the thing that you need to evaluate or analyze creates issues as you're not checking for vulnerabilities and issues in the rest of the organization. Having that overly narrow view on the EHR only really helps you get some confidence in the EHR, but the auditor and the hackers will look at the rest of the stuff that wasn't analyzed. One is having an accurate inventory. If you don't have an IT asset inventory, you don't know what is present in your network. And if you don't know what is present in your network, evaluating the risks presented by unknown things is very difficult. So a crucial step there, make sure you know what's in your network. Your information technology team should be able to look at the network devices, the firewalls, and at least tell you what they're seeing, and that can help in creating that device or server inventory, and then start from there. Policies and procedures, those can be very difficult to develop. You must have risk analysis policies and procedures that detail how you do your risk analysis. Documenting all of those can take time. Getting them approved by your board and then trained out to all the staff takes a lot of time as well. Overlooking simple fixes is an interesting one. When you do a risk analysis, you're often going to find, I hesitate on saying always because nothing's absolute, but I'll say it here. You're always going to find something that needs to be fixed. Focusing on the most critical things is a good idea, but don't let that sort of take away from fixing the small, simple fixes. If a large critical fix will take 3 months to get some product selected, implemented, and deployed, but there are 100 little simple fixes that each take a minute to do if someone would just do them, those simple fixes can improve the overall security of the organization rather quickly while you work on the bigger thing.
Charles, I hate to put you on the
So
spot, but could you give us an example of what a simple fix might be?
a simple fix would be installing a patch on a server. If a server is at an old version of an operating system,
Okay.
it may not have a patch available. Updating the operating system may be a more long-term difficult task. But there may be ways, simple ways to resolve the issue, like maybe you don't need that software that has a vulnerability. So you can remove that software from that server and fix that simple issue while you wait for the server operating system to get updated.
Right. And, I've also seen in some of these analyses where software just needs to be configured differently. That could be relatively quick.
Absolutely. Yeah, like everybody having full access in the EHR.
Right.
That may be a simple to go through and at least remove some of the people that you know don't need full access.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So what is the difference between a review and a full risk analysis? You talked about the need to do reviews earlier, but tell us more about what's involved.
So we talked about the analysis, that being a comprehensive, complete, thorough, defining your scope, identifying your inventory, creating policies. The review is really an update to that initial analysis. When you have that first analysis complete, you'll have a document detailing all of those items, your scope and inventory. The review is an update to that, and that can be done on a periodic basis. The thing that OCR and HIPAA want to see is a continuous improvement process. So whenever there's a change to that scope, go back and identify what part of that risk analysis was affected by whatever change that was. A classic example would be switching from one EHR to another. That obviously removes the risks that were presented by the old EHR, but now you have to identify what new risks are presented by the new EHR. Did that affect your inventory at all? Did it affect your scope? Maybe it has features for mobile device access from the internet or only from within the organization. So doing that review is typically a shorter, faster process, but it's just as important to get completely right as the risk analysis initial creation.
Well, that raises an interesting question, because when then would you reach the point where you might say, look, I've made so many changes to my security environment because, let's say, I have brought in a new AHR and maybe I've got new hardware to support it. When do you say, okay, I need to just go ahead and have another risk analysis so that I have a good baseline going forward because so much has changed?
Yeah, I don't know that I can tell you when so much. There certainly is a tipping point where identifying the changed risks is more burdensome than just doing a risk analysis completely from the start to finish. A lot of that's going to depend upon the different organizational size.
Sure.
And the technology they're using, the scope they've identified, the inventory. One thing that I push for when I consult clients is scope reduction. Reducing your scope makes the cost and difficulty of compliance much easier. If you only have to worry about a handful of servers that talk to nothing else in the world, your scope is just those handful of servers. Unfortunately, reducing the scope that far cuts off a lot of functionality. So balancing, minimizing that scope with maximizing your functionality, all in the interest of making the burdens of compliance easier and more secure, is a difficult task.
That's a really interesting point.
Some organizations will do a formal third-party risk analysis every year just to make that easier. That does come at some expense, so you might want to do an analysis every 3 years, formal third-party, and do a review internally on those intermediate years.
All right. What documents should I retain to protect my practice in the event of an audit, or, God forbid, a breach, I suppose, would be included as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Short answer there, everything. Every document that went into the evaluation and identification of all of the risks that were found, any documentation that went into how you chose to address those risks. Addressing a risk doesn't mean removing the risk. There are a number of ways to address a risk. Some of them aren't available to the HIPAA world because they have rules about what you can and cannot do. You can obviously remove the risk. Classic example there, install a patch that fixes the bug. You can transfer the risk, which typically means buying insurance. We all buy car insurance, and that's not addressing the risk or not removing the risk that we'll get into an accident, but it is transferring the risk so that if I do, I don't lose as much money as if I didn't transfer that risk. You can accept the risk. Again, that's not allowed by HIPAA. You're not allowed to just say, well, that risk could happen and we'll deal with it. To some extent, we all accept the risk of a car accident. So how you choose to address the risk is up to you, but that documentation and determination of what risk mitigation you chose needs to be kept as well. Any documentation on policies and procedures, how they were approved and developed, how they were trained to staff, how they're enforced, any enforcement of those policies, including sanctions, any documentation about technical safeguards of the different products you use. Your EHR especially should be able to give you a document of, here is what we do in our EHR to safeguard the PHI that you put into the system. So documentation, documentation, documentation.
Yeah, a lot of important counsel in there, Charles, because, for example, I know in the audits, there's many places where the audit protocols say, and of course it's in bureaucratic language, so I'm just going to paraphrase, but they say, is the practice doing this, and does the practice have documentation proving that it does it? So the example you mentioned brought this to mind, sanction policy. If somebody breaks your privacy policies, they're supposed to be punished in some way. They would like to see examples of when you've done that, if you have had to do it.
Absolutely. Yep. One other thing that I've heard that we'll look for is how you handled or addressed those risks. Is your chosen risk addressing selection appropriate and sufficient? So some organizations, passwords, there's a touchy subject. Passwords nobody likes. I get that. I don't like them either.
Right.
But in today's world, you need a strong password. That password needs to be updated once in a while at least. That doesn't add to the security, but it does make it so that if it were compromised, it no longer is. Password policy in the HIPAA language, they simply require that you have a password policy management. They don't tell you that it has to be 8 characters. So you could comply, I believe, with HIPAA and say, we have a password policy that it has to be at least 1 character. Now, when that causes a breach, and when you get audited or through the breach notification, they will ask you, why did you think that was sufficient and appropriate?
Right.
And I won't be able to help you with that. Industry best practices are a different story. If you say, well, it has to be complex, it has to expire every 90 days, it has to be 8 characters, can't be shared with anyone, now industry can help you and say, that's a known best practice, that password policy fits and satisfies every HIPAA compliance anyway.
Right, so if there was a problem, if they were looking at it, they're not going to come to you and say, why are you so crazy as to do best industry practices, as they would if you used your 1-character password.
Yep, absolutely. So it has to be appropriate, has to be sufficient.
And the other thing, I suppose this would go in with this, what you were talking about earlier in terms of that continuous improvement. You obviously, as you're continuing to reduce your risks and address those, you want to document every step of that as well, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right, let's go to our next question. What can I expect after the analysis?
So more of an answer if you choose to do a third-party analysis. There is some expectation that you will get findings on your risk analysis. No matter how secure you are, Some of that you can cynically say is the risk assessment or risk analysis organization wanting to prove to you that the money you paid them was worth it. So they're going to find something. So the value of what they find, or the criticality of what they find, is something to consider when they find something. But they're always going to find something. So similarly on your internal risk analysis, there's always going to be, in my opinion, stuff to find, stuff to improve. So before you start your risk analysis, make sure you're allotting time and resources and potentially capital to resolve whatever it is you find, that unknown stuff that will need to be fixed. What it is, you don't know, but assuming that you'll be able to do the risk analysis in a month or 2 or 3 and just be done, ignores the fact that you're going to find something and that something will have to be fixed. It's ignorance to not know what's wrong with the environment. It turns into more on the side of neglect to know what's wrong and not put any effort in fixing it.
So what then about attestation?
So in your attestation, when you attest for the meaningful use attestation, you'll have to attest that you did your security risk analysis. That attestation will provide the evidence that you've done that. They will want to see some evidence that you've done that if they come back and audit your attestation. If you're audited and requested to provide documentation, it's sufficient to provide that risk analysis report. It's not always asked for when a provider is audited, but it's good to be prepared for it.
Well, and we've heard from friends who work more in the MU space that it's very common for practices to fail MU audit because they ask them, can you where's your risk analysis? And they don't have anything. They can't prove that they actually did it. And that is just an instant fail. And it's the same under the new rules. If if they come and ask you for your analysis, that is a core objective. Well, they don't call it that now. They keep changing the language, but that objective, you can't get any score under MIPS if that's not done. Like you lose.
Yep, absolutely.
So it's worth taking care of not only for inherent security, but also because of the hit it would put on your reimbursement as well. So this is a great one because I hear this question all the time and it's difficult to answer, certainly for me. So we look to your guidance on this one. How much time do I have to resolve findings from a risk analysis?
Right, this is a difficult one, and I don't have a clear answer for anybody, unfortunately. Some things are just not that clear. It's going to heavily depend upon the risk that was identified and how long it should reasonably take to fix it, given the organization's ability to dedicate resources and time to fixing these issues. So they're going to want to see that progress is continually being made towards fixing these. And unfortunately, they will be the ones that are the judge on, is the time that's being spent towards fixing these things reasonable? If the risk analysis was provided and 8 months go by and there's no evidence of activity towards addressing those risks, they're going to assume that you're not making an effort towards fixing those findings. If, on the other hand, 8 months goes by and half the things have been fixed and you've got documentation of meetings and purchases to fix issues, that goes a long way. It does tie into a little bit the focusing on or overlooking the simple fixes. If there's a way to break your team that's addressing these risks up, some of them start just going through the easy, quick fixes. The other members of that team focus on the big things and start putting projects together to address those issues. Audits have started. The audits will be directed at organizations of all sizes along with their business associates. If your organization receives an audit notification, you'll have 10 days to upload those supporting documents to demonstrate that your compliance program is consistent with the new HIPAA protocol. So it's all that documentation showing that you are trying and working towards a more secure environment. they don't expect anyone really to be perfectly secure. I don't think that's possible. But they do expect that organizations are looking for the risks in their environment and working to resolve them.
And that is a question I think everyone on the call should ask themselves. We've talked about this need to keep documentation and have a security file. Well, imagine if you were to get that call or email, or you're told by OCR that you have to submit this information. If you've got a well-organized pile of security documentation, you're in a great place. If you don't, you're in a really difficult place trying to run around and reproduce it or find it all. I just think that'd be a nightmare.
I agree. The 10 days seems short. That's 2 work weeks and you're done.
Yeah, that's not much time. Well, on audits, we've mentioned them plenty of times, but we haven't talked a whole lot about, what they entail. So there's a random audit program, and so they will just pick people, so far as we know, just at random. And then do they actually show up at the facility, or how does that work?
I have not yet been involved in a HIPAA audit formally by the OCR.
Okay.
But I believe they send notification that your organization has been selected. Congratulations.
Right.
Please upload the supporting documentation. There, I would bet there will be an on-site visit. If they're doing a comprehensive sort of assessment, they need to know what the physical security looks like. Do you have those classic monitors facing out windows type thing?
Right,
so
right next to the bus stop.
Site visit. They will comb through any documentation you upload and let you know what problems they have with it.
Now, you had mentioned business associates as well. So if you get audited, they're also going to want to know, that your business associates are compliant and that they've signed agreements, right?
Yep, absolutely. The interesting part there on business associates, the breach reporting form for the OCR's Wall of Shame it lists who the covered entity is first.
Right.
So you never see a case where it's the business associate listed first. The covered entity is responsible for reporting the breach, even if the breach happened at the business associate. So
right, even if it's all the business associate's fault, the covered entity is still wrapped up in it.
Yep, the business associate will be listed on that breach report, but it's the covered entity's name first. They're the organization that has the most responsibility, assigned responsibility to the protection of that PHI. So audit your vendors, make sure that they're doing what they say they're doing.
Right.
OCR is going to want to know that you didn't just go out and get some business associate and they signed an agreement so you're in the clear. They're going to want to know, what did you do to make sure that business associate was implementing HIPAA compliance?
Right. I mean, if you ever even, for example, talk to the security officer with the business associate, whoever's in charge of their security, to see if they can answer anything about what they've done in terms of HIPAA requirements. That alone would be more than a lot of people do.
Yep.
Well, we have time for questions, and I'm excited. We've got several already. This is a rare opportunity to get the advice of a real expert in this field, so take advantage of that. Before we get to the questions, I want to thank Netgain for sponsoring this event. Folks have asked about how they got a little bit of feedback there. Seems to have resolved. Folks have asked how they can get help with a risk analysis. Well, that's certainly something that Netgain does. So we'll talk more about that in a moment. Their URL is right there if you want to look at it. But it is a real treat for us to have that support from Netgain to bring you this learning lunch. So we thank them for that, and we'll talk more in a little bit about their services. But let's get to some questions first while we still have time. So I think we addressed that one. There's several questions that are sort of like this, Charles, that say like, this one says, what firms, organizations can perform a security risk analysis for small practices? So there's several questions that address this small practice issue. I get the sense that maybe small practices are concerned about cost and also don't know how to find resources. Could you address that?
Sure. So I don't have a ton of information on the different risk analysis firms at different organizational sizes. What I do have experience with is the organizations that we've dealt with for risk analyses do sort of scale their pricing. So it's based on the size of your environment effectively. They can and should be able to help you in brainstorming ways to reduce that scope of compliance, which would reduce your cost in doing an analysis. There are a number of firms around the country. A quick Google search without naming too many vendors because it'd all be central Minnesota basically. A Google search for HIPAA, risk assessment, risk analysis. I know I said those two words are interchangeable. Some organizations may interchange them when doing this. When you contact them, make sure you ask about the risk analysis that they perform and how it complies with the HIPAA requirements, meaningful use requirements. If they don't know what those are, move to the next one.
That's a great point because there's lots of different kinds of risk analysis, right? I mean, there may be a firm that does great risk analysis in the financial realm or something, but that doesn't mean they know anything about HIPAA.
Right, right. Yep. So adding that to your search, if you put in security risk analysis, third party, you should find a lot of hits. Select some that are local and start calling around and evaluating their sort of competence. Look for referrals, talk to their referrals.
Well, Charles, I thank you for being agnostic on this point, but just talk a little bit, if you would, about Netgain, because you guys do this as well. In fact, you do like a full security, you offer many security services. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So we focus more on the hosting of the data. We're a HIPAA business associate. We host the servers, the data center, handle the backups, upgrades, patches, security, firewalls, all those fun things for the data center environment. We do manage the local environments for a few clients as well. We don't get in the business of doing the security risk analysis, however.
Okay.
We don't want that risk analysis to be under a poor light for our clients. If a client of ours for whom we host their infrastructure, their environment, was audited and they asked, where's your risk analysis? And they said, oh, Netgain did it, so here's the report. And then they ask, where's your data hosted? And they say, oh, Netgain hosts it. We don't want to put our clients in that position of, well, isn't that a conflict of interest?
Sure.
So
but you've done risk analyses yourself, though.
I've done them not as a project and here's a certification. It's been more of a consultative approach.
Right.
Over the phone discussion of brainstorming, here's where your scope is, here's what needs to get addressed, here's some risks as I see it. But I don't want that to be used, and I advise the clients to have the risk analysis independent from their IT hosting partner. More to remove that risk or that conflict of interest than any inability of ours to do the work.
Sure, that makes sense. But I wanted to talk more about this question of scope that you touched on before we get to more questions from the audience. So it seems to me there's two issues here that I wanted to follow up on. One is you've got scope as scope in itself, you know, simplicity supports security. And you talked about that tension between functionality and simplicity, that the fewer things that are in the scope, the easier it is to secure them, but on the other hand, you might lose functionality that you really want. So I'd like you to address that tension more. The second point I was just going to make is you said, it reduces costs, and that makes sense. Maybe we could talk more about that after you address the first point. What is that? How does that tension work? And is it just the case that a lot of organizations just have too much junk on their network that they really shouldn't have on it?
Yeah, it's a fun word to use.
Junk, I'm sorry, I don't mean to insult the photocopy.
That's all right, it's a technical term now.
Right. Too much stuff.
There's certainly a new way of thinking in terms of how you architect your environment. The question I come back to is, does every computer that has access to the EPHI also need to have access to the internet?
Okay.
And I think the answer is no in many organizations. Now, there certainly may be some computers that need access to both the internet and the PHI, or computers, workstations that do research and need to interact with different organizations over the internet. Certainly they need access to both. But for exam rooms come to mind. Now, I don't get too much into the inner workings of each organization, so mileage will definitely vary here. But I believe that the exam rooms probably don't need those exam rooms computers connected to the internet. They shouldn't need to get to Facebook. So removing those computers from the internet access, segmenting your network in a different way so that some computers can get to the PHI and nothing else, can really reduce the scope and concern of those computers. So there is a trade-off between functionality and convenience and security, but some of those trade-offs are pretty small in my opinion. We're going to cut off Facebook from this computer, and probably nobody will care except the patient that happened to climb onto the computer when the doctor left the room.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Facebook, because that's one of the questions from the audience is, do organizations need to set strict policies on things like social media? How should they handle that? Because on the one hand, I mean, there's a convenience factor. People sort of want it, but is that a real security risk?
Absolutely, it's a real security risk. There are things called malvertisements. It's a combination of the words malicious and advertisement. So advertisements contain code, computer programs, that allow them to display audio and video or take surveys. We've all seen those on every website we go to nowadays. That code can be malicious, and a number of, in particular, ransomware campaigns have taken advantage of that ad network and had that ad network distribute the malware through malicious advertisements, malvertisements. Going to reputable websites is no longer a necessarily safe approach. Those advertisements are simply provided by the ad network, and the website has no knowledge of what code is in that advertisement. So reputable websites, Huffington Post, Answers.com, have had instances of malware on them through advertisements. Facebook can do the same thing.
Yeah, I can't remember the stat, but I saw somewhere once that Facebook said it received, however many hundreds of thousands of various types of malware attacks, both against it but also against its users every day.
Yep, absolutely. So in my opinion, if an organization can cut off the internet access to the majority of the computers in their environment, they're going to get some outcries from people wanting to book a plane trip for the family vacation that they're leaving on in 5 hours or whatever. But I think that can be offset by outfitting a break room with a fleet of computers that's on a very separate network that has access to everything on the internet, but no access to any APHI. And then I think you'd still be well served if you give the employees an extra 15-minute or half-hour break every 4 hours or something. They were probably spending that much time on their computers anyway on those other ancillary sites. That keeps that malicious advertisement threat out of your environment that contains EPHI. Now, this is not an easy task to do, but it is something to start considering and in terms of reducing that scope. Now you only have to worry about a small network that doesn't even have access to the internet and a few computers that have access to PHI and the internet.
Well,
I got a lot of long-winded there.
No, I think that's fantastic advice, to have that segregated network, because it comes back to what you mentioned before, that the scope has to expand to, I can't remember your language exactly, but has to expand to a firewall, essentially. You phrased it better.
Yep. One additional point I'd like to make on that.
Please do.
Some EHRs do require access to the internet. They're cloud-based EHRs, and they're fine to use. The firewall can be configured to say those computers in that heavily protected network can access that EHR website, but nothing else. So you can selectively allow communication to internet resources and disallow everything else.
All right. Someone just asked about that same issue about cloud-based internet access.
Oh, good. I read their minds.
So, but say a little bit more, because I'm not sure I completely understand it. You're saying that the computer would just be able to use the EHR and not be able to just run around on the internet? Is that sort of it, and putting it in crude terms?
Yep. I'll draw a very simplistic, I will add, analogy. When you go to a local restaurant, Applebee's or whatever, I don't know if Applebee's is a nationwide chain, so nobody knows what that is.
I think it is.
Sure. Your order and credit card and payment is all handled on a kiosk that's out in the open floor. And if you watch the wait staff, they go up to that, they swipe in, they get to their account and their tables that they're managing. They swipe the credit card to pay for the order, they bring your credit card back, they swipe out, and they're logged out of that session. I'd be very worried if I saw the wait staff go over to that same kiosk and pull up Facebook. Yet that's sort of the environment that I won't single out medical, because most organizations are in that world of, from this computer that can access all private client information, you can also access any website in the world. And I think that needs to change and sort of mirror as much as it can how the restaurant industry does it, that they've got these kiosks where, no, they can't get to Facebook. If they want to get to Facebook, we've got a break room that has computers, and they can get to anything except for any of the internal restaurant systems. So it's a very overly simplistic analogy, I will grant, but I think that we can get closer to that paradigm, but it's going to take work.
Well, I think it speaks to the fact that there's almost an extent to which digital technology has been thrust on a lot of healthcare organizations. Like certainly I think some clinicians feel that way, that they aren't used to thinking of secure networks, put it that way. Like, they're not used to thinking of these trade-offs around risk and access. And so I don't think that a lot of organizations have really grappled with how they need to protect EPHI through a secure network, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely, and you saw that with the resistance to electronic medical records. Doctors love helping people, and I love that about doctors.
Right.
They didn't want to go electronic. They loved having the paper charts that they could look at. We aren't going to get into a discussion of pros and cons of electronic versus paper, but they don't want to deal with the computers. They want to deal with helping people, and they're seeing technology as a way to make it easier to help people. And that's a difficulty the entire industry has to face. How do we make it easy for the doctors to help people so that they don't need to think about the technology as much?
Right.
And we're trying to cross that bridge, but the technology, as you said, has been thrust upon us, and the security industry is playing catch up.
Interesting. So let's get to another question from one of our attendees before we run out of time. This is actually one of our longtime fans and a great student, Ray Coons. Oh, shouldn't have said your name on the air, Ray. I apologize. But we think the world of Ray, so we're glad to have him on. The question is, in light of the 2017 CMS Pick Your Pace program, the claims adjustment penalty can be avoided by attesting to a single measure objective. I believe that the SRA is still required under HIPAA. Is this correct? Ray, I think it's not correct. I'll let Charles answer that. But the claims, picking your own pace, even if you choose a single measure, you have to satisfy the risk analysis objective no matter what. Like, you can't just do another objective and not satisfy that one. The language is kind of complicated. I'll bring Wayne in on this, another of our instructors, later. But it's pretty clear that you have to do that no matter what, or you just are not going to get any, you'll get the reimbursement penalty if you fail to do it. Charles, is that your understanding?
Gotcha. So to paraphrase, you're saying, is the risk assessment, the risk analysis, required no matter which one of the objectives you select?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Yeah. So yeah, that particular measure has to be met no matter which ones you select. Yep.
Yeah, that, for folks who aren't living in this new world that CMS has brought to us, they've changed just about everything, it feels like sometimes, in the last couple of months with MACRA and with the new MIPS regulations. Yet, it looks like everything's changed on the surface, but if you get inside of it, everything has not changed. And so that requirement that people are accustomed to under meaningful use, that you have to do that risk analysis during the reporting period, that is still the case. That has not changed, and I don't believe it ever will change because they've made security such a priority. Would you concur?
Right. Right, and I think that's in recognition of where the industry is and how far it has to come. And again, this isn't singling out medical. This is true across the board, and it's a problem with computer technology and environments today. Unless an organization is making security a focus and working towards making their systems as secure as they possibly can be, they likely are missing something. And that missing something could be a big deal.
Right, and if you read the language that's coming out of HHS, there's always so much, but they really talk about all of the goals they want to achieve in terms of health information exchange and interoperability. They require sound security as a foundation, like as a prerequisite, basically, or the industry is never going to be able to achieve those sorts of things.
Yeah, the industry won't ever achieve perfect security, but
sure,
they can get a lot closer. Industry can get a lot closer to being very secure.
And the government clearly wants it to be a very high priority for people.
Right, yep.
Well, Charles, we're almost out of time. I want to ask just one more question. You folks do a lot with cloud hosting, and our last learning lunch was very interesting on that subject. I invite people to look it up on our YouTube channel. How does that play into this? I know we don't have a lot of time and there's different risks involved, but I'm thinking specifically in terms of reducing scope. How can moving more into the cloud help simplify your security?
It really puts some choke points on the access to the PHI. I manage a lot of the security, all the security in the data center environment. So the patches, the different protection mechanisms that we've got installed and in place are all there because there are threats that we know about. By hosting it in a data center like ours, you transfer a lot of the sort of responsibility for implementing security controls to another organization. That doesn't remove the local network from any client or clinic. The local network still needs to go through a risk analysis. The local clinic always needs to go through a risk analysis, regardless of how much they transfer, to identify risks presented by their local workstations. If their local workstations still have access to the internet, their local workstations still have opportunity to get compromised by malware. That malware can then record all of the information that that computer can see. We serve ours through Citrix or terminal services, Windows terminal services, so our clients see a desktop, much like they would see on their own computer. They don't see much of a difference. And that leads to a little misunderstanding about where their computer is. Some hold the position that just because they see it on their monitor, it isn't touching their computer because the monitor is displaying what's hosted in the Netgain data center. But the monitor is still attached to the local computer, and any malware running on that local computer can see what the monitor sees, to put it simply. Same thing with the keyboard and the mouse. Anything you type into the keyboard still has to go through the local computer to get to the hosted desktop. So understanding some of those things is difficult at that point. But that's where we focus on removing as much of the technology from the environment and hosting it in a data center with more security controls than are typically applied at a workstation level.
Yeah, I mention it because I know you're an expert in the field, but also I personally believe that this is really the future, that a lot of, as bandwidth improves, people are going to move more and more into the cloud precisely for some of the reasons that you mentioned, that you have professionals like you handling many of the important security aspects on a day-to-day basis rather than folks who are, doctors and nurses trying to do it on their own. It just makes so much sense, and I think that the industry will move more and more that direction than it already has.
Yeah, the way I like to look at it is we take care of the technology so that the doctors can keep taking care of people and not worry about the technology as much.
That's a great way
Same
of
is true
putting
with any client. Let us do the technology. You
Right.
guys can focus on what your business is.
And I'm sure that many providers would be very happy to sacrifice their having to deal with the technology. Well, we are out of time. Charles, again, great learning lunch. I think a lot of food for thought here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed our conversation. Folks have asked again about getting the slides and the recording. I know that one person had audio problems. Seems to always happen in these online events, but not to worry. We're going to send follow-up emails that will give you information. It'll give you the slides, the video recording, and other information. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your questions. I hope you found it valuable. And thank you again to Netgain for sponsoring this event. They help us bring you this free learning, and we are very grateful to them for it. So we will see you at our next Learning Lunch event. You can find out more information on our homepage. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to you joining us for the next Learning Lunch. Thank you so much.